Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm going to be reviewing No Motherland Without. This is a Twilight-Struggle-esque game about North Korea, designed by Dan Bullock and published by Compass Games. Alright, so here's the board for No Motherland Without, and as you can see, it is very, very red. This is possibly the reddest game I have ever seen in my life, and I'm here for it. So for this review, I'm going to be giving you just a tour of what the different parts of the board are doing. Essentially, this is a lighter version of Twilight Struggle that is about a struggle between North Korea and the West. So not necessarily specifically the United States, but this is definitely North Korea versus everybody else over there. And we're going to be having a tug-of-war on multiple fronts. The game lasts for 7 turns unless you get 2 No Motherland Without event cards that can appear from the deck. And basically those represent the death of Kim Jong-il and the ascent of his son, Kim Jong-un. Each side, of course, has slightly different win conditions. One way the West can win is if at the end of the turn, they've brought DPRK prestige down below critical. On the flip side of that, if the DPRK has high prestige and then also passes a ballistic missile test, then they win the game. It's also possible for the game to win in a draw. We're going to talk about this generation map over here, but if at any point every citizen on here is either a defector, dead, or imprisoned, then the game immediately ends in a draw and neither side wins. And if none of those things happens by the end of the game, then on the final turn, either turn 7 or the turn where your second No Motherland Without event occurs, then you'll decide the victory by points. And North Korea can gain points by having good infrastructure. The West basically gains points by having defectors trying to get out of North Korea. This is a card-driven game, so we will definitely be looking at some of the cards momentarily, but first let's do a tour of the board. The central part of the board is where a whole lot of action is going to play out, because this is where the North Korean side is going to be placing their infrastructure markers, trying to spread infrastructure across the country and build it up to higher levels. Meanwhile, the West player is going to place outages here and try to block the development of infrastructure in North Korea. Basically, at the end of each turn, if the DPRK can't meet these different thresholds in terms of a combination of infrastructure in the country and elite citizens on the generation map, then they're going to lose face, and that helps the West. So hamstringing North Korean development is a good thing for the West in this game. Here we just have our turn markers. These are reserves. Just like in Twilight Struggle, the cards in this game have events on them, and they are also playable for activity points. And if you don't use all of your points on one turn, you can actually place them in reserves here to have a bigger turn later. So that's definitely a strategic element of the game. Here's our prestige track. You need to watch it because this is part of victory conditions for either side. There are some specific events in play that you're going to want to mark over here. These are rations. So North Korea starts the game with maximum rations, but those are going to drop over time. And as the DPRK starts to starve, the West gains action points, just free action points to play on every turn. So the West in this game literally profits from the starvation of people in North Korea and their inability to have power. And this game is definitely about a battle for hearts and minds, because another major component of this board is the generation map. Both the West and the DPRK players are going to want to use this a lot. Essentially, for the DPRK, you're going to want to promote these people with stars on them, at least as your priority, as elite people. That basically adds to your threshold on each turn of infrastructure, because if you don't have enough infrastructure, at least you have some elite citizens who are happy with you and who feel like they're being rewarded by your system, which is super messed up, but based on my readings about North Korea, that's not completely inaccurate. You're also going to end up purging previous generation elites as you move through the generations of the game. So this is the Juche era, which is your first era when Kim Il-sung was the leader of the DPRK. And then you have the Songun era, which is where Kim Jong-il takes over, and then you have the final turn, which is kind of extending into the present. So here's where elites are promoted. This is also where defectors are chosen to try to make a run for it to the West. And there's a bit of a spatial puzzle going on here, because it basically costs the West more to move defectors out of the country if they are next to elites, but it costs them less if there are dissenters that they can place the defectors next to. So this map becomes a visual representation of who is dissenting, who is elite, who is in the process of defection, who's been imprisoned, and who has been killed. And because this essentially represents the human capital of North Korea, if everybody ends up dead, in jail, or defected, then it's a draw because the West has basically not done anything to save a whole lot of people, and North Korea has cannibalized its entire population. There's also a defector map. So in order to get defectors out of the country, they have to make a very long and dangerous journey. So there are two routes for defectors to take. Essentially, the goal is always to get to South Korea. But you could either do that by going down through mainland China into Thailand and then South Korea, or you can do that by going across the Gobi Desert and hoping for the best. However, you'll see this die roll. Not all of your defectors will survive. If you try to go through the shorter route through Mongolia, you have to roll 5 or higher for them to live. So this game very much represents the sort of risk-reward aspect of going through the Gobi Desert. You can take a longer route where there's more chances of the North Korean player messing with you, or you can take the quicker route through Mongolia, but you may die. And of course, the Western player is just trying to get defectors out. So there's definitely a sense of dehumanization in a lot of aspects of this board, because for the West, yes, they want defectors to escape, but it's really more about increasing their victory status on the board. Meanwhile, as the DPRK player, you're just going to arrest and kill people all the time. Over here we have ballistic missile research. So basically what's going on over here is that throughout the game there are the occasional cards that will trigger a ballistic missile test. So basically one of your action options as the DPRK player is to take cards out of your hand that are events for you or neutral events, and you just stash them over here. So you don't get to use the events, you don't get to use the action points. Instead, you're stashing them for a future missile test. You can place multiple cards in each slot on the board, but essentially you put your missile cards on slots that correspond to the number of top level infrastructure tokens that you have out on your map. So the better your infrastructure, the higher value your ballistic missile research is going to be, because the total value of the cards that you stash over here can't count for more than your top infrastructure, even if the actual value in the cards exceeds it. So there's a strong link between doing well here and passing ballistic missile tests over here. And what's interesting is that every time you pass a ballistic missile test, unfortunately you have to clear out all of your cards and start over again, but your prestige goes up. However, your global opinion goes down, and that's the next part we're going to talk about on the board. So essentially different things in your action deck are going to sway global opinion one way or the other, and depending on how global opinion is trending, the West can get a whole bunch of benefits, or the DPRK can get a whole bunch of benefits. So global opinion matters because you're accidentally giving stuff to your opponent. At the same time, you're going to need to take that hit in global opinion as North Korea, because you need to do those ballistic missile tests to increase your prestige. And of course, if you can get onto high prestige and then pass a ballistic missile test, you win the game. And of course, this is also one of the reasons that the United States is very interested in keeping your infrastructure low, because by placing power outages here and messing around with what you've built, they're decreasing the strength of your potential future missile tests. So everything on the board kind of connects in ways that become more clear as you play the game, but that offer a very rich experience of these dueling priorities and challenges between North Korea and the West. The other thing that's interesting about this game is that not all events are one time. The No Motherland Without You holding box is just a track when the first card with this name comes up. But you also have these enduring events that stay until there are other enduring events that push them off the board. So if you play an enduring event to this spot, it'll just move down as more of those longer lasting events are played until it's eventually pushed off the board. So what that means is that you have some events that have long-running consequences, but they may or may not stay on the board as long as you want, depending on what other enduring events emerge. I did mention that this is a CDG, a card-driven game, so let's have a look at the cards really quick, and then we'll go to some final thoughts. So this game is played out in 2 decks of cards. The first 3 turns come from the Juche deck, so this is sort of the beginning stages of the game. On each turn, each side gets 8 cards, and basically you will play cards until your hand is entirely empty, and when both hands are empty, then you'll go on to the next turn. All right, so let's just pretend that we are looking at the North Korean hand, and they have a crazy hand because there's tons of United States events in here. Boo. So the way that your turn works when you're playing your cards is that you can choose to play your cards for the action points on them, for an investment where you put the action points into your reserves for a future turn, or for the event if it's your event. If it is not your event, then it's going to trigger for the other side. So I can't get these 3 points without letting the United States do a 1955 food crisis on me, and that really sucks. So let's talk through some of the options for the turn. So when you play a card for points, if you're the DPRK, then you are using those points to do things like improve infrastructure, uncover defector routes, imprison defectors, and then purge elites. And you can also put cards aside if they're your events to do ballistic missile activities. If you're the West, then your activities include placing outage markers, placing route markers on the defector routes to help the defectors get out, moving defectors, and then appealing to the global community to try to make the North Korean side look bad. So if I'm the DPRK, I can do something like play this event for the points, but the other side gets to do their event. Or let's say that I want to do Sea of Blood, then I can play this as an enduring event, which adds AP to all my cards, or I can just take the points. So because it's my event, I have to choose what I want to do. I can take these 3 points and spend them in some way, or I can take the event and try to give myself some longer running points using the enduring event. The other thing that's special for the DPRK side, however, is that as we're playing through these cards, I have a couple of special options up my sleeve. The DPRK starts with 2 kind of get out of jail free cards. There's Aid from the Kremlin and Aid from Beijing. Aid from the Kremlin is removed on turn 4 to represent the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So North Korea depended on aid from other, quote, communist countries in order to keep its people fed. And when things started to fade, there was starvation in the country on a mass scale. So you can use Aid for the Kremlin, but only within the first 3 turns. You also have Aid from Beijing, and they both do the same thing. Essentially, they allow you to discard 1 card without triggering the event, and then you get to conduct 3 activity points worth of activities or investment. So these are basically a way to get rid of Western events that you really don't like and to get some AP to work with anyway. There's only 2 of them, so you have to use them carefully, but you do get just a little bit of wiggle room. So again, this is a game where you're going to use your cards either for points or actions to build or destroy infrastructure, depending on what side you're on. Mess with these different meters about prestige, rations, global opinion. Put points in reserves for massive future turns. Build or destroy defector routes and help defectors get out or catch and arrest them. And meanwhile, you'll be placing markers on these people on the generation map to represent what is happening to them and their individual fates during each game. You are in fact on the Beyond Solitaire channel, so I'm also happy to tell you this game does solo. There's some instructions here for which cards to switch out. So there's some optional cards that you put in for solo, and then you take a few other ones out. There's some guiding principles for playing as the West. And then over here, you actually have a decision tree that's fairly simple. And then essentially you will play for the West using this decision tree. So it helps you decide what to do about events, where you're going to place outage markers. So you can either make that decision for yourself, or there's a little map that helps you decide Western priority depending on how comfortable you feel playing the AI more actively against yourself. And then there are priorities for defector routes and how to handle that. There are also special guides for how to handle some of the events to make sure that you're giving yourself the best challenge possible in this game. One thing to note is that you will always play the DPRK in the solo mode, and the West will always be the opponent. There is no bot to play the West against the DPRK. So yes, to play the game solo, you will have to manage a hand of cards for the West, but there is a simple decision tree to help you figure out what to do. And as you can see, it's really just this one page. It's not particularly complicated. And that's No Motherland Without. So now for some final thoughts. Overall, I think that No Motherland Without is a solid game. It's entertaining, it works well, it has a reasonable intuitive solo chart, so I was able to play it solo successfully. And it definitely had some interesting choices because of the interconnectedness of everything on the board, the pain of having to give the other side events that benefited them, and also the push between trying to just survive on the board versus maybe going for an earlier victory before turn 7. So I definitely enjoyed playing this game, and I think that anybody who likes Twilight Struggle will enjoy it. That said, if you want something that's different from Twilight Struggle, I'm not sure that this game was different enough. If anything, it's a more simplified, more streamlined version of a game that feels quite similar. So make sure that that's what you want if you pick this one up. I will also say that in some situations it felt like the rulebook was a bit undercooked. I was able to find most of the information that I needed somewhere in the rulebook, but there were definitely situations where basic things weren't said in the obvious spot. And so even though this game is actually relatively simple, it's not that hard to play, I spent time being paranoid that it was harder than I thought it was because the rulebook left some things out. I highly recommend that you read the example of play that's in the back of the rulebook because that was quite helpful. So mechanically, I'm not sure that this game was super innovative, but where I do think that this game really pushed the envelope and did something important is in its theme. I feel like Bullock really pushed the human aspect of how hard things are in North Korea under an authoritarian regime and with help, if it can be so called, from Western nations that don't want North Korea to get too powerful under current conditions. The game really makes it clear that the people who are suffering from that are the people, because it's the people of North Korea who are getting power outages and who are trying to defect and maybe getting arrested or killed, who are starving when the rations go down, and the West happens to get more action points from that. It was really moving for me to have to make choices on the generation map because those are actual human faces on that map of actual people from North Korea, and deciding who I was going to promote to being an elite, deciding who I was going to purge a generation later, figuring out who was going to be imprisoned or who would die. There's definitely a human element to this that I think is really interesting and that I think this game needs. I actually think it's a fascinating choice that the solo mode for this game only allows you to play as North Korea, which basically forces you into the role of an autocrat who considers their population to be somewhat disposable. And having to enter that role in terms of gameplay really made me think a lot about what are North Korea's goals? What would my goals be in this situation? Do I consider the West to be particularly good based on what they're doing in opposition to me? Or are they altruistic yet highly self-interested? And of course, nothing's going to make you sympathize with North Korea if you read about what happens there, but it's interesting to have to play North Korean leadership knowing that the resources that you're using, abusing, and crushing are your own people. It definitely makes you feel gross, but in a way that I think is a good thing for this game. Also, while you can't model everything, I thought it was really interesting the way Bullock chose to connect the infrastructure of the country, the missile research that's happening on one side of the board, and North Korea's prestige worldwide. Because connecting those elements created a narrative that made North Korea's goals at least make some sense within the context of the game. So I really liked the unsparing look that this game gave us at power dynamics between North Korea and the West and within North Korea in the form of a game. I'm not an expert on North Korea, but actually in conjunction with this game, I ended up reading Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick, and I thought it was a fantastic book. So if you also want to pair a book with this game, I'll link that one down in the show notes because a lot of her comments about infrastructure and technology, I think, fit thematically really well with what's happening in the game. That said, this is fairly heavy subject matter. It's not an optimistic game about the state of the world or about the way that we treat people who are not elite people. But if you're down for something that's a little bit grittier and you want a solo game that has a Twilight Struggle feel, then I think that you'll enjoy No Motherland Without. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and happy gaming.